I often find myself sitting down on a bench and dreaming of how it used to be. Yeah, history can tell many a story. You find me this morning at the end of the Ellesmere arm. Now, don't get mixed up with Ellesmere Port, even though that has loads of history too. I'm at Ellesmere in Shropshire. Just that way is the Llangollen Canal. Yeah, I've been looking at a bit of history around here, and it's quite interesting. At the moment, I'm stood at the head of the arm, and you can see a very large Tesco just behind me. But in 1811, a large foundry was built here. It was William Clay's foundry, officially known as the Bridgewater Foundry, and the original owner was the great nephew of the Lord Bridgemere from Worsley fame, who actually started the canal movement. But yeah, back on where the car park is here, lay William Clay's foundry, large employer in the town, and made a lot of farming equipment. Was famous for its ploughs and its prize-winning miniature steam engines as the technology progressed. But it was a very large employer in the area. And still on the towpath, you can see some of the main gates. It was so popular in the town. In fact, later on when we get to the boatyard, you will see a large stove that was built by William Clay's, and a lot of the grids around here are actually made by William Clay's also. But sadly, the foundry closed in 1920 and then reopened, gave birth again to a dairy, but sadly in 1987 that was too closed. It lay derelict for some years, and now of course it's knocked down, nothing remains. Indeed, where Chugs is now moored, there used to be buildings opposite as well. A lot has changed and gone, and I don't know whether it's for the better, but it should always be remembered. William Clay's was very much part of the town. In fact, he had a nice shop, hardware shop, on the corner of Wharf Road there, Wharf Street. Very nice, and you can still see the plough above the door now, so if you're in Ellesmere, come and take a look. As you come under Bridge 58, which is that way, that's where Hurlston Junction lies. But as you come under Bridge 58 to your port side, you will see Beach House come up. A lot of people call it Telford's House, but let me tell you a bit of a story about it. In 1793, Thomas Telford was employed to design and build the Llangollen Canal. So 1793 he started. 1805 the canal was finished here, and it was rumoured that all through the build Thomas Telford would oversee the build from Beach House. He didn't. The house itself wasn't built till 1806. In 1805 obviously the Llangollen Canal was completed, and Thomas Telford became a consultant or advisor, if you like. So we would have no doubt had board meetings in one of the rooms there in the roundhouse at Beach House. Now I'm walking to Ellesmere Yard. It's a maintenance yard, mainly built in 1806, literally for the maintenance of the canal here. As you walk down the lane here, the first thing you see is number 1. Beach House. Number 1, Beach House. Lovely building. Used to be the foreman's building here of the yard. Later he moved into the yard itself and is now still owned by the CRT, but rented out as an accommodation. Very lovely old building. I just love it here. Just past the manager's or the foreman's house is this rather intriguing building. Now this building that you see behind me was built in 1860s. One little corner of it, you'll notice a little window, and that's where the employees used to get paid. Yep, that was the pay office, and the hole just above the door that you can see, that's where there used to be a clock. Used to clock on, clock off, and get their wages from there. Marvellous old building. The rest of it as is now, is used for stores. To the right hand side of the pay office you can see what's called the pine loft, mainly used for storage. The lower half of the pine loft was built in 1806 and is part of the original buildings. Latter upstairs was put on again in the 1860s. Some very heavy equipment has to be transported around the maintenance yard back then, and little tram rails were put where people could push little carts with everything on. Sadly now, I think it was about 12 inches, a foot of tarmac has been put over all the tracks. You hardly see a soul nowadays. I have spoke to a couple of employees, and hi Les if you're watching. But it's hard to imagine back in the day. This would have been a hustle, bustle, very, very busy place. Of course, the canal would have been working, carrying goods here, there and everywhere. There would have been working boats, horses, and indeed stables here. Lots going on, very, very busy. Now, it is still a working maintenance yard, which is nice to see. But of course now, modern technology and things, only half the employees. Just in front and to the right of the Pine Lodge is this building. It does look just like a normal little garage. But this building too had history. This used to be a sawmill, and back in the day young lads were employed to go under the saw, poke with wooden sticks to clear the old sawdust out of the saw. Take a look at where they went in. They would go down to a little well under the saws, through this little alleyway. Wasn't the world a different place? This building here, just to the right of that little alleyway, is a little storeroom, as was. And there you can see a urinal from the 1860s. Oh dear. And I'm not taking the urine. That really was the urinal from the 1860s. And this door here hides a secret. That is the old forge. And can you notice the bell there? The forge is still in use today. It is a blacksmith. It does work for the Pontcysyllte, does work for the CRT, doing all sorts of metal work, and does, I think, take on private contracts. It was marvellous in there to walk around the other day, having a look at all the old tools, thousands of different tools. Of course, if the blacksmith couldn't find a tool, he would make one. So he's probably got half a dozen of the same tool. It didn't matter to him. It was just metal and would take minutes to do. You can see where they used to cast the cartwheels in the floor, and indeed there were several castings around the room, and that was for doing the wheels on the old cart horses, not the cart horse, but on the old carts. Marvellous building. And the bell was in case you wanted the blacksmith. Rather than go in there when he was busy working, you could ring the bell and it would give a different tone to his ear, because when he's hammering the anvil he has to keep the momentum and the rhythm going. So you would ring the bell and it would sound different to the blacksmith, and he would know you're there. Right, let's take a look up the stairs. Yes, we all went up the stairs and into a room on the right hand side as we went up there, and that room is called the pattern room, full of hundreds and hundreds of wooden models to make castings for things on the waterways. There were cogs in there for lock gates, for the paddles. There was cogs in there for lift bridges and swing bridges. All were made out of wood. They looked like metal, steel, iron, but they weren't. They were wood. They were all very, very light. It was marvellous to see them. Absolutely amazing work. They would obviously be used to make castings. Molten iron would be poured into the castings, and then they would be fettled and make perfect equipment for the waterways. It was marvellous to see. And one of the most interesting castings there, or wooden pattern that was made, was a plug. Throughout the canal network there are indeed plugs. There's some on the Pontcysyllte and on most aqueducts to drain the aqueducts down, and even on some bridges there will be these plugs. It was strange to see, but good. Just across the landing was one of the joiners' workshops, but there was a hole in the door and little Noah was intrigued what it was for. It is indeed for the workshop cat to chase the mice and the rats. This joiner's workshop was a lovely room to see, but the most impressive thing that stood out for me was that little thing sticking out the wall up there. That holds the desk for the foreman. The foreman would sit there nice and warm, bear in mind, because the forge was just underneath. He would sit up there and he could overlook all the yard and make sure everyone was working. Still has his original notebooks in the drawers, and it only got 3 legs on it, remarkably, but it's lovely view, and it's nice to imagine him sort of sitting there overlooking the yard. In a way, it was lovely, but lovely workshop, nice tools and everything in there. You could imagine the noise and the heat in there, unlike the workshop down below. The workshop down below in the winter was a very, very cold place to work, unlike the joiner's workshop upstairs. Now, this building was built in 1806. But the adjoining buildings that you see were all added on in the early and late 1860s. Now, this large joiner's workshop will be very hot in the summer, especially with the tin roof up there. But in the winter, it would be a very, very cold place to work. Not very nice at all, in fact. They only had one little stove in the far corner to keep the whole workshop nice and warm. Up until 1960, lock gates were manufactured here. They're now made up in Yorkshire and the West Midlands, only 2 places. They're made of the finest British oak. But back in the day, the big heavy pieces of oak would be brought in and lifted with the crane onto small trolleys that were put onto the rails here and pushed and pulled into the workshop. In fact, there was one almighty cock-up back in 1948. They built some very, very large lock gates here. They manufactured them, made a beautiful job of them, and then found they couldn't get them out the workshop. So parts of the walls were actually taken away so as they could get the gates out. But all was good in the end. Over the years, most of the buildings were extended upwards as well as sideways. You can see where the old apex of the original yard would have been. But over the years, it's grown somewhat. At the far end of the joiner's workshop, we were led up some stairs, and there was the old meeting room. They used to hold meetings there. The foreman would hold meetings with his charge hands, or whatever you called them back then. But they had a beautiful stove in the corner, made by William Clay's foundry. If you remember, at the far side of Ellesmere Arm, they manufactured lots of things. But yeah, lovely stove there would have kept them nice and warm. But this has been a marvellous tour here. One more place to visit. And it's this building. It's the dry dock and stables. Now, what you see here are the offices for the CRT, but back in the day, these would have been many, many stables for all the workhorses that, of course, would have been around back in the day. It's just lovely that these buildings haven't been changed too much. Beautiful windows. The dry dock is just round the corner and is still used today. The dry dock is still, as you can see, very much in use today. On the far side of the dry dock there are 2 arches, but back in the day in each arch was a crane, a little jib. And what they used to do was put boats in there and put weights up to 8 ton onto the barges, and then they could gauge how much it would go down in the water, and they would put brass plates and etch where each ton was, and then they could sort of work out the payloads for the boats. But it is an interesting little dry dock, that obviously nice and light now with modern day lighting, but back in the day they would have just had the windows, and there were several on the far side of the dry dock. If you're to go left and head towards Llangollen, you will see the services round there and the side of the boatyard. They used to store coal and lime under the little gantry there at one point where the services is. Obviously nothing's stored there anymore, but you do get a little glimpse of the boatyard as you cruise past. Well, I do hope you've enjoyed that little tour of the Arm and Ellesmere Yard. We had a great morning there on the CRT tour. It was really informative and well recommended. I think they're doing them now the second Saturday of every month, and if I can, I will put a link in the description below where you can book in completely free. It was marvellous, and even the kids enjoyed it. We used it as part of their homeschooling. I think our favourite part was definitely the pattern room with all those castings, and they showed us some red castings there, the wooden plates, and they were all for the Pontcysyllte. Anything on there from foot plates to handrails, everything for the Ponty was painted red, but it was marvellous. See you next time.